Namaskar and welcome to the Indologia podcast. There is something that I've said many times, and I've posted that many times on my stories and on my tweets, that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Those who forget what happened to their ancestors, what happened in their past, will most probably have it happen to them all over again because they would have forgotten the warning signs of when it happened the last time around. And no group of people in the world does this apply to more than the Hindus of India, who have very conveniently forgotten their real history, what happened to their ancestors, the genocides, the sheer number of genocides that their forefathers went through. And the Hindus have forgotten that very conveniently and have fallen for the trap of the pseudo-secularism that is prevalent in India. And then it makes you wonder, why is this the case? Why is it that the Hindus do not know their history? Why is it that so many myths, so many blatant lies are prevalent amongst the Hindus? Are the Hindus not being taught the real history? It might seem like a simplistic reason, but that is in fact true. Because the current version of Indian history was formulated by a few misinformed or motivated British historians. But many Hindus participated in popularizing this version in the mistaken belief that they were thus proving the superiority of India's spiritual culture over the materialistic civilization of the modern West. In due course, this became the standard lore taught in our schools and colleges under the system of education sponsored by Christian missionaries and British bureaucrats. The same system of education has not only contributed after independence, but has also multiplied manifold. It has spread this version of Indian history to larger and larger segments of succeeding generations. Muslim and Marxist historians have promoted it with an ever-increasing zeal. They may not have any use for Hindu spirituality, but they find this version of Indian history very convenient for advancing their imperialist causes. And in the process, India's history has become a history of foreign invaders. The Greeks and the Scythians, the Arabs and the Turks, the Persians and the Portuguese, the Dutch, French and the British, rather than a history of the greatest civilization which the world has known, and later on of Hindu heroism, which fought and ultimately frustrated all foreign invaders. India itself has become a subcontinent seething with a mass of heterogeneous humanity, rather than an ancient and indivisible Hindu homeland. Indian people have become a conglomeration of nationalities, racial groups and religious communities which are finding it difficult to coexist in peace, rather than a national society which is trying to reform itself and reclaim some of its unfortunate sections alienated from it by successive waves of Islamic, Christian and modern Western imperialism. And Indian culture has become a mechanical mixture of odds and ends, indigenous and imported, rather than a homogeneous whole created by a vast spiritual vision which is finding itself ill at ease with incompatible impositions. The national perspective had become diluted when some scribes, patronized by an opportunist or self-alienated political leadership, had started parading Siraj-ud-Dawla, Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan and Bahadur Shah, the last Mughal, as Indian patriots, and pillaring Mir Jafar and Jaichand as traitors. It had become distorted when the Mughal Empire had begun to be depicted as a native political system in which its victims, the Hindus, were harangued to take as much pride as they had done earlier in the Mauryas, the Andhra and the Gupta empires. And it had suffered a total perversion when the Mamluks, the Khiljis, the Tughlaqs, the Sayyids, the Lodhis and the Bahmanis were transformed into indigenous dynasties on par with the Rashtrakutas, the Chalukyas, the Chandelas, the Chauhans and so on. In the process, the bulwarks of national resistance like Mewar and Vijayanagar were reduced to puny Hindu principalities on par with provinces ruled by Muslim governors, and indomitable freedom fighters like Rana Pratap and Shivaji Maharaj were cut down to the size of local chieftains, on par with Muslim rebels who frequently ran foul of their imperialist overlords at Delhi or Agra. It was this version of India's history which gave a good conscience to the British imperialist while he pulverized Hindu society, plundered Hindu wealth and poured undisguised contempt on Hindu culture. It was this version of India's history which emasculated Hindu society and emboldened the residues of Islamic imperialism to stage street riots and then walk away with precious parts of the Hindu homeland, thus consolidating an aggression which had not succeeded even though mounted again and again for more than 1,000 years. It is this version of India's history which is being invoked by the fifth columns of Islam, Christianity, and Marxism, each of which looks forward to a final conquest of this country with the help of foreign finances and, if need be, foreign firearms. And it is this version of Indian history which is being promoted by power-hungry politicians who woo the Muslim vote bank while they divide Hindu society into mutually hostile camps. Hindu society owes it to its own survival in the present and to the prosperity of its future generations to repudiate this perverse version of India's history and to put the record straight so that no one dares divorce Hindu spirituality from Hindu heroism, Hindu nation from the Hindu homeland, and Hindu culture from the national culture of India. Hindu saints, sages, and scholars in general, and Hindu historians in particular, have to come forward to do their duty towards their society and culture and to pay homage to their ancient heritage. Hindu Dharmashastras have enjoined upon every Hindu to repay according to his or her capacity the Rishi Rin, that is the debt that we owe to our seers and sages, by passing on to the next generation the Veda and the Itihas Purana, that is the spiritual and cultural vision of Sanatan Dharma and the historical tradition of Hindu heroism. In the present situation, this is perhaps also the best way to repay the Pitra Rin, that is the debt that we owe to our forefathers for the protection, preservation, and perpetuation of our great Hindu society and its continuously creative culture. These standard textbooks of Indian history taught in our schools and colleges do not highlight at all the stupendous failures of the Islamized Arabs in the face of heroic Hindu resistance. What they highlight instead is the series of successful raids made by Mahmud Ghaznavi into the heartland of India and the subsequent crumbling of Hindu kingdoms in North India before the determined onslaughts of Muhammad Ghori. The two Islamic invaders are presented as the rulers of a small sultanate in Afghanistan as against the powerful Hindu kingdoms. The impression that is left at the end of it all is that northern India was more or less a walkover for the warriors of Islam. Solid facts, recorded mostly by Muslim historians of medieval India, tell an entirely different story. The Ghaznavids and the Ghurids in the story are not rulers of small principalities. They are formidable powers with the resources of vast empires at their disposal. Muslim historians have floated two myths about Mahmud Ghaznavi, who had succeeded his father Subuktigin in 997 CE and who became famous for his 12, or according to another count, 17 invasions of India. The first myth is that he was interested primarily in demolishing Hindu temples, breaking Hindu idols, capturing prisoners of war, and amassing wealth by plunder, and that he did not harbor any serious intention of building an empire in India. But the very fact that he had annexed to his empire, spread over Khorasan, Iran, Iraq, and most of Central Asia, the Shahia domain in the northwest, and the Punjab, as also the Multan, which was a Muslim principality at that time, goes to prove that he would not have hesitated in doing the same to other parts of northern and western India had he found it feasible. He failed in this design not because he lacked the intention, but because he met a very stiff resistance in these parts. It is true that his superior military might and skill as a commander succeeded in defeating, in the initial encounters, most of the Hindu princes he met on the field of battle. But the rising tide of resistance in the wake of every victory threatened to engulf him soon after, with the result that he had to content himself with plunder and prisoners of war and relinquish the coveted territories which he just could not hold. The second myth, which has been built up to bolster the first, presents India as if it was an open country, which he could enter and leave as and when he pleased. But this myth also is not supported by the facts of recorded history. The contemporary Muslim historians seem to imply that Mahmud's armies easily vanquished the infidel armies, and there was no opposition worth the name. But a closer scrutiny of all available sources, contemporary and later, reveal a very different story. Mahmud led his first invasion against the Shahiyas of Udbanpur in 1001 CE when he advanced upon Peshawar. Raja Jaipal was caught unawares and could not mobilize all his forces in time. The lack of a standing army was to prove the undoing of many Hindu princes in days to come. In contrast, the Muslim militarists always maintained their armed hordes in a permanent state of mobilization. Even so, the Hindus fought an obstinate battle in the face of overwhelming odds. They, however, depended upon slow-moving elephants, which proved a poor match for the highly mobile Muslim cavalry. They were defeated, and Jaipal himself was made captive. But Mahmud did not dare annex any Indian territory. He released Jaipal in exchange for just 50 elephants. He had had a taste of Hindu heroism, and he beat a hasty retreat. On the other hand, Jaipal thought himself unworthy of the throne he occupied and burnt himself on a funeral pyre to which he set fire with his own hands. This was a demonstration of the Hindu sense of honor, which no defeated Muslim marauder could ever match. Jaipal's successor, Anandpal, proved equally valiant. He refused passage to Mahmud's army on their way to Multan in 1005 CE, and this led to a battle which Anandpal lost. His son, Sukhpal, was taken prisoner and converted to Islam. Mahmud had to rush back to Ghazni to meet an attack from the west. He left his Indian possessions in the hand of Sukhpal, who, however, soon returned to the Hindu fold. Here was an opportunity for Anandpal to attack Mahmud from the east, but Anandpal proved too magnanimous to take advantage of the difficulty in which his adversary was placed. Instead, he offered to go to the aid of Mahmud with a sizable force. Anandpal thus lost the only chance of crushing an enemy and was soon to pay the penalty. Mahmud invaded India again in 1008 CE. According to Farishta, Anandpal sent ambassadors on all sides inviting assistance of other princes of Hindustan, who now considered the expulsion of Mohammedans from India as a sacred duty. Accordingly, the Rajas of Ujjain, Gwalior, Kalinjar, Kannauj, Delhi and Ajmer entered into a confederacy and, collecting their forces, advanced towards Punjab. The Indians and Mohammedans remained encamped for 40 days without coming into action. The Hindu women on this occasion sold their jewels and melted down their gold ornaments to furnish resources for the war. Mahmud ordered 6,000 archers to the front to endeavor to provoke the enemy to attack his entrenchments. The Khokhars penetrated into Mohammedan lines, where a dreadful carnage ensued, and 5,000 Mohammedans in a few minutes were slain. Utbi admits that the battle lasted from morning till evening and the infidels were near gaining victory. Farishta reports that Mahmud saw his plight and sent some of his elite warriors to attack the elephant on which Anandpal was sitting and directing the contest. The elephant took fright and turned and fled. That broke the morale of the Hindu army. It was neither the first nor the last occasion on which the Hindu army became an uncontrollable rabble and suffered defeat and slaughter simply because the elephant carrying its commander turned tail. The Muslim armies were more disciplined. The Shahiya dynasty now established a new capital at Nandana in the Salt Range. They contested every inch against subsequent raids of Mahmud. The next battle took place in 1013 CE. Trilochanpal, who had meanwhile succeeded Anandpal, retired into the hills of Kashmir, where the Prime Minister of that kingdom came to his help with a large army. Kalhan has described this battle in glowing terms in his Raj Tarangini. Utbi writes that the action lasted for several days without intermission, and that the Hindus lost it only when they were drawn into the plain to fight, like oil sucked up into the wick of a candle. Kalhan concludes, even after he had obtained his victory, the Hamira did not breathe freely, thinking of the superhuman prowess of the illustrious Trilochanpal. The Shahiya king, with his son Bhimpal, known as Nidar Bhim, now established a new seat at Lohara on the border of Kashmir. Mahmud tried to storm it in 1015 CE. Farishta tells us that this was the first disaster that the Sultan suffered in his campaigns against India. After some days, he extricated himself with great difficulty from this peril and reached Ghazni without having achieved any success. For obvious reasons, the contemporary Muslim historians do not mention this particular expedition. The Shahiyas were no longer in a position to arrest the forward march of Mahmud, nor was Mahmud in a position to dislodge them from Lohara so long as a single scion of the dynasty remained alive. Trilochan Pal was killed in 1021 CE, and his son Bhimpal 5 years later, fighting Mahmud all along at different places and in league with different Hindu princes. Years later, Al-Biruni wrote, "The Hindu Shahiya dynasty is now extinct, and of the whole house there is no longer the slightest remnant in existence. We must say that in all their grandeur, they never slackened in the ardent desire of doing that which is good and right, that they were men of noble sentiment and noble bearing. The Shahis fought with valor and tenacity for nearly 50 years. They ultimately collapsed against the repeated onslaughts of the Turks, led by one of the greatest generals their race has produced, but not before 3 generations of the Shahi kings had sacrificed themselves on the battlefield." The next Hindu dynasty to offer resolute resistance to Mahmud Ghaznavi was that of the Chandelas of Kalanjar and Khajuraho. The Chandela contemporary of Mahmud was Raja Vidyadhar. He had fought and killed Rajapal, the Gurjar Pratihara ruler of Kannauj, for abjectly surrendering his territories to the Musalmans. Trilochan Pal and his son Bhimpal had joined him along with several other Hindu princes in order to stem the tide of Islamic invasion. The Ghaznavi marched against Vidyadhar in 1018 CE. He sent a messenger to Nanda, as Vidyadhar was called by the Muslims, asking him to become a Muslim and save himself from all harm and distress. Vidyadhar returned the reply that he had nothing to say to Mahmud, except on the battlefield. Mahmud ascended an elevated spot to survey the Hindu host. According to Nizamuddin Ahmad, a medieval historian, when Mahmud saw what a vast host it was, he repented of his coming, and placing the forehead of supplication on the ground of submission and humility, Mahmud prayed for victory. Fortunately for him, the Hindus did not engage him in battle immediately. They made a strategic retreat. Taking this opportunity, Mahmud also quickly ran back to Ghazni. He had obtained neither plunder nor prisoners of war. Hindus could have destroyed him had they pursued him in his retreat. But that was a vision which Hindus had lost. Pursuit of a retreating enemy was contrary to the Rajput code of honor. The Hindu confederacy also seems to have dispersed soon after. So Mahmud did not have to face a united Hindu host when he once again invaded Chandela territory in 1022 CE. He laid siege to the fort of Gwalior to start with, but failed to take it after investing it for 40 days and nights. Next, he advanced on Kalanjar. This time also Mahmud failed to force a conclusion, and the campaign ended in mutual gifts and compliments. Later Muslim historians have tried to represent this exchange of complimentaries as tribute. Evidently, Mahmud had to be satisfied with only a verse and a few elephants. He never paid another visit to Chandela territory. The most famous of Mahmud's misdeeds is the one at Somnath. According to Farishta, the battle raged on with great fury, and victory was long doubtful for Mahmud. According to another Muslim account, 50,000 infidels were killed round about the temple. The like of this faith which inspired these 50,000 sons of the soil to embrace death will be hard to find in the annals of any other land. Mahmud succeeded in demolishing the sacred image and plundering the temple treasury, but the rallying of Hindu forces from far and near frightened him into beating a hasty retreat. But he dared not return by the road he had traversed on his way to Somnath. Gardizi writes, "Paramdev, Badshah of the Hindus, stood in his way, disputing his path. Mahmud decided, therefore, to leave the right road back to Ghazni from fear, lest this great victory of his should turn into defeat. He left by way of Multan and Mansura. Many of the soldiers of Islam lost their lives in this way. And then, of course, there is the story of the two guides, two big devotees of Somnath, who misled the Muslim army deep into the desert as an act of revenge, which ended up costing a lot of the Muslim lives to Mahmud. The Jats of Sindh also had molested this army during the retreat from Somnath. So Mahmud's next expedition was organized against them. But the Jats were very powerful, and according to one Muslim account, they had invaded the principality of Mansura and forced its Musalman Amir to abjure his religion. Mahmud is reported to have mobilized a large number of boats to fight the Jats, who had taken to the river. But the whole account smacks of unreality. Gardizi mentions only one camp of refugee families whom the Muslim army robbed. This amounts to an admission that the expedition ended in failure. Mahmud's successor was Masood, and Muslim generals under Masood led some raids into Farther India from their base in the Punjab. One of them was Ahmad Nialtigin. He surprised Banaras, stayed there for a day, and returned with plunder. Another general, Salar Masood, who was a son of Mahmud's sister, reached up to Bahraich in northern UP, where he and his large army were surrounded by Hindu princes and destroyed. Hindu princes now took the offensive against the Muslim invaders. Farishta writes as follows: in the year 1043 CE, the Raja of Delhi, in conjunction with other Rajas, took Hansi, Thanasar, and other dependencies from the governors to whom Mudud, the successor of Masood, had entrusted them. The Hindus from thence marched towards the fort of Nagarkot in Kangra, which they besieged for 4 months, and the garrison, being distressed for provisions and no succor coming from Lahore, was under the necessity of capitulating. The Hindus, according to their practice, erected new idols. The successor of the Raja of Delhi gave such confidence to the Indian chiefs of Punjab and other places that they put on the aspect of lions. 3 of these Rajas advanced and invested Lahore. In the final round, Hindus failed to take Lahore, but they kept their hold over other places in the Punjab for quite some time. The Muslims renewed their raids after Prince Mahmud, the son of Sultan Ibrahim of Ghaznavi, was appointed governor of Lahore in 1075 CE. Meanwhile, Bhoj Parmar had died in 1055 CE and Raja Karna Kalchuri in 1072 CE. Both these princes were dreaded by the Muslims. Prince Mahmud was defeated and driven away by Lakshmadev, the Parmar ruler of Ujjain. Mahmud also tried to take Kalanjar, but the Chandelas again proved more than a match for the army of Islam. Muslim historians record only his safe return from Hindustan and thank Allah for it. Ibrahim's successor, Masood III, fared no better. The army of Islam were defeated repeatedly by Govind Chandra, the Gadwad ruler of Kannauj. Inscriptions of Hindu princes around this period speak again and again of the rout of the Turushk armies. These may refer either to the failure of feeble attempts which might have still been made by the Ghaznavid kings to extend their dominion in India, or to the extermination of isolated pockets of Muslim domination beyond the Punjab. One of the worst defeats suffered by the Muslims was at the hand of Arnaud Raj, the Chauhan ruler of Ajmer. The Muslim commander fled before the Chauhans. Muslim soldiers died of exhaustion and an equal number perished from thirst. Their bodies lay along the path of retreat and were burnt by the villagers. A Chauhan Prashasti of Ajmer Museum, line 15, states, "The land of Ajmer, soaked with the blood of the Turushkas, looked as if it had dressed itself in a dress of deep red color to celebrate the victory of her lord." A Hindu counterattack was launched after Vigraharaj, the successor to Anur Raj, conquered Delhi and Hansi from the Tomars. His repeated victories led him to the claim of having rendered Aryavarta worthy of its name by the repeated extermination of the Malech. all territories south of the river Satluj seem to have been freed from Muslim rule. Muslims had two more advantages in addition to their aggressiveness and superiority in the art of warfare. During this long period of Indian resistance, the infiltration of Arabs and later on the Turks continued almost unabated into India, both through armed invasions as well as through peaceful migration from Central Asia. The Hindus, true to their Catholicity of religious outlook and rich tradition of tolerance, never obstructed the peaceful immigrants and even zealously granted them security and full religious freedom. The greatest Chishti saint of India, Sheikh Moinuddin Chishti, came to Ajmer just before the battles of Tarain and was able to attract a number of devoted followers. It is all the more remarkable that this Hindu tolerance towards the Muslim merchants and mystics should have continued even after the invasions of Mahmud of Ghazni. And even Professor Habib points out, the far-flung campaigns of Sultan Mahmud would have been impossible without an accurate knowledge of trade routes and local resources, which was probably obtained from Muslim merchants. The same can be said to hold good about the invasions of Muhammad Ghori or Qutbuddin Aibak. The Sufis were working not only as the spies of Islamic imperialism, but also as deceivers of gullible Hindu masses. The only saving grace was the Hindu heroism in the face of an inveterate Islamic imperialism. Such heroism has seldom been seen in the annals of any other people. This story can help us correct the current notion that Hindus have always been and continue to be a race of cowards who have invariably run away from every contest. The notion has become prevalent not only among the non-Hindus but also among the Hindus themselves due to a wrong teaching of Indian history over a long period of time. Hindus have to revive and reaffirm their old tradition of heroism. They have to make it known to all concerned that they are not going to tolerate those forces and factions which question the independence and integrity of their country, nor remain passive towards those elements which are trying to tamper with the Hindu character of their homeland in the name of secularism or composite culture or minority rights or some other subversive slogan. At times and in certain situations, the frontiers of a nation are not merely physical, they are also ideological. We shall never be able to overcome our predicament vis-a-vis Pakistan unless we understand her ideological frontiers and define our own. Compared to us, Pakistan is much smaller in size and population. She is much poorer in industrial infrastructure and other resources. And yet, she has attacked us so many times. And she's preparing feverishly to attack us again as soon as she feels that the time is opportune. This is not the normal behavior of a normal nation. This is evidence enough that the basic motive of her behavior lies elsewhere than in the cold-blooded calculations of military balance, strategic or tactical. The mullahs, military generals and the mass media in Pakistan have all along harked back to the glorious deeds of Mahmud Ghaznavi and Muhammad Ghori, when the accursed Hindu Kafirs had a true taste of the Islamic sword. They have always looked at us with contempt as cowardly baniyas who are bound to surrender in course of time. We on our part have always dismissed this strain in her stance as mere poetry, which may entertain her own people but which we should not take seriously. We have never tried to pin down this strain as an ideological strain, which goes beyond Pakistan's physical frontiers and makes her a member of the larger Islamic world, sprawling away from both sides of our borders. Medieval Muslim historians tell us that Mahmud Ghaznavi used to be highly praised and heartily congratulated by all Islamic countries of that time whenever he returned from India with plunder and prisoners of war and with idols of Hindu gods, which were then placed on the doorsteps to mosques in Ghazni, Baghdad, Mecca and Medina to be trampled upon by the faithful. Whatever their own differences with Mahmud Ghaznavi, in this context, they were all agreed that he was doing the work of Allah and had the blessings of the Prophet to support him. The Islamic State of Pakistan has not been able to repeat the exploits of Mahmud Ghaznavi so far. But whenever she has attacked us, she has been applauded by the rest of the Islamic world and has received all-round support in her role of a mujahid, in spite of the fact that we have been espousing all Islamic causes abroad with a fervor and consistency which puts to shame the Islamic states themselves. Till the end of the 60s, the support which Pakistan received from the Islamic countries was mostly moral support, because the latter were in no position to extend much material aid. But since the early 70s, the oil-rich Islamic countries have been providing the massive finances which enable Pakistan to build and maintain her huge military machine, including her nuclear establishment. The United States may be selling the sophisticated hardware which Pakistan has been piling up with frantic speed, but the bill is being footed largely by the oil-rich Islamic states of West Asia and North Africa. This should be sufficient to prove that Pakistan is not an individual state. On the contrary, it has become the spearhead of an Islamic bloc, which is increasingly becoming not only more prosperous and better equipped militarily, but also more fundamentalists, more self-righteous, and more militant for the spread of Islam. Nor are Pakistan's ideological frontiers confined to the Islamic countries alone. They are spread out to a sizable section of our own population. We have never faced, frankly and honestly, the unpleasant fact that, with some honorable exceptions, our Muslim countrymen, by and large, are supporters of Pakistan and other Islamic countries as against us, whenever they have to choose between the two. There is a conspiracy of silence about this stark reality. Admitting it even privately to ourselves, not to speak of discussing it publicly, will be a serious slur on our secularism. But the truth cannot be wished away so easily. And a price has a way to be paid for turning away from truth, particularly when the security of a nation is involved. The Rajput states of medieval India fought so tenaciously and for so long in the face of an inveterate foe, not only because they were trying to preserve certain physical frontiers, but also because they were trying to protect a social order and a cultural complex created and sustained by Sanatana Dharma. These Rajput states were Hindu states in consciousness as well as character. They stood firm and spared no sacrifice because they were proud of their ancient Hindu heritage and looked down with contempt on the barbarism represented by Islam. They failed in the final round only because they could not pursue a forward policy due to their lack of understanding about the nature of Islamic aggression and in the absence of a central state which could have pooled their resources, maintained a standing army, and updated the art of warfare. Today we have a central state, a standing army, and some sort of a central government. We have also proved in these several contests forced upon us by Pakistan so far that we have not seriously neglected our armory or the art of warfare. All that may lull some people into a belief that we can take care of Pakistan whenever she goes berserk. But the advantageous factors in our favor are more apparent than real. We are self-confident vis-a-vis Pakistan only because we have not been able to see the deeper forces working towards our defeat and ruination in the long run. And that long run may prove to be not so long this time because of the changed character of warfare. The state which we have in India today does not resemble even remotely the Rajput states of that period. By no stretch of imagination can it be called a Hindu state. Far from harboring any Hindu consciousness or having a Hindu character, it does not even reflect the objective reality that Hindus constitute an overwhelming majority in this country. And instead of recognizing Islam as a species of barbarism, it patronizes Islam as an integral part of the Indian heritage. Thus, for all practical purposes, this state is a legacy of the bygone British Raj, rather than a conscious creation of any national spirit or vision. The constitution which controls and moves the structure of this state is only a mechanical device for keeping together what it regards as a conglomeration of contending communities, religious, racial, regional, rather than an embodiment of any national aspirations, in spite of all its high-flown verbiage borrowed in bits and parts from several models in the West. It has singularly failed to touch the heart of the Hindu masses whom it treats like handicapped children sunk in stupor and sloth. On top of it, the mind which has dominated the central government and evolved its policies since the dawn of independence is infinitely worse so far as Hindu society and culture are concerned. This mind is not only self-alienated, it is also self-righteous in the name of what it describes as secularism, socialism, and some other slogans borrowed from abroad and broadcast with intense zeal. It not only repudiates with repugnance any suggestion, which is often made by the so-called minorities, that it shares any Hindu sentiments, it also carries within it a deep-seated anti-Hindu animus. It frowns upon every expression of Hindu culture in our public life in the name of what it flaunts as composite culture, which most of the time means the culture of Islam imported into this country by force of arms. It denounces as Hindu communalism even the most dignified defense of some perfectly legitimate Hindu causes, while it smiles indulgently or looks the other way when Muslim hooligans take out violent demonstrations in support of causes which have not even the slightest relevance to this country. And it smells Hindu chauvinism in whatever small effort Hindu society manages to make in order to strengthen itself. And while it aids and abets the consolidation of highly aggressive Islamic forces financed by foreign powers. What is still worse is the role of our political parties, which are quite a few in number, but which shout the same set of slogans. All these parties scowl or shy away when Hindus plead that they also have a case. But all of them incorporate more and more Muslim demands in their manifestos and feel fulfilled when mullahs and Muslim politicians condescend to speak from their platforms. The more malevolent the mullah and the Muslim politician, the better it is for the secular credentials of the party concerned. All these political parties corrode the cohesiveness of Hindu society by fragmenting it into smaller and smaller vote banks on the basis of caste or sect or language or some other secondary differences which no normal society can do without. At the same time, all of them contribute to the consolidation of a single Muslim vote bank, which in turn blackmails them further, and which has come to wield an influence and a representation out of all proportion to its known numerical strength. The vote-hungry politics, which is promoted by these highly sloganized parties, is practically devoid of any public content, even of a local character, not to speak of any national concern. This politics has increasingly come to revolve around the personal ambitions of wily politicians, rather than round any national policies or programs. The more dishonest the politician, the better he fares in public life. Politics has become a rat race, in which every politician who wants to survive has to play the game according to certain well-understood but seldom spoken rules. Most politicians, except those in power, have to live from hand to mouth and be always on the lookout for more and more money to meet the mounting election expenses. This has opened the floodgates of corruption by foreign money, which in recent years has come to mean Muslim money flowing in ever larger volumes from the oil-rich Islamic countries. One cannot help suspecting that the secularism sold by certain political parties in an all-round atmosphere of cynicism is more a matter of financial compulsion than a matter of conviction. The Islamic countries, which pay for the conspicuous consumption and high lifestyle of some politicians, particularly in the opposition camp, can always call the tune. Our conflicts with Pakistan were not at all of our own seeking and were imposed upon us by a saber-rattling Islamic state. Our armed forces carried out terribly the tasks assigned to them, but every time the politicians allowed the aggressor to escape without paying any penalty whatsoever for this unprovoked aggression. The victories won by our armed forces on the field of battle at the cost of so much blood and sacrifice were bartered away by the politicians on the tables of diplomacy in exchange for nothing more substantial than international applause. Take the much trumpeted triumph in 1971. Our armed forces did everything that was expected of them and gave a good account on every front. But at the diplomatic table in Shimla, we surrendered every advantage we had gained in exchange for a set of signatures on some pieces of paper by a 1,000-year war demagogue, Bhutto, who went back and immediately launched an ambitious project for making nuclear bombs. Again, we freed the people of East Pakistan from the tyranny and terror of their brothers in faith from West Pakistan, but we did precious little to ensure that Bangladesh does not revert to the old ways of her parent state. The result is there for everyone to see. Bangladesh has proclaimed that it is an Islamic state and has become as hostile to us as Pakistan has always been. The Bangladeshis are not only converting by force or hounding out the Hindu and Buddhist populations, but also pouring hundreds of thousands of Muslim infiltrators through our borders in Assam, Bengal, and Bihar. The blood shed by our Jawans and the sacrifices made by our civil population in shouldering the burdens of war have gone in vain. Hindu society has to make up its mind that it is no longer going to tolerate this degenerate politics which has been disintegrating Hindu society on one hand and consolidating the Muslim millat on the other. Only a politics created by Hindu consciousness and guided by Hindu ideology can retrieve the situation and meet the challenge of Islamic imperialism. And this, my friend, is it for this episode of the Indologia podcast. The excerpts that I read to you were from a book called Heroic Hindu Resistance to Muslim Invaders 636 AD to 1206 AD by Sri Sitaram Goyal. It's a fantastic read. It's a very short read also. You can finish it in probably an hour or so. Please give it a read. And I hope you gained something from this podcast. If you did, please give it a nice rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whichever platform you are listening to this on. You should also follow me on all the social media platforms. The name is the same, Indologia, Indologia. Until the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.